background noise or a side screen type of a presentation. My hope is that you're going to participate and you're going to be present so that you can get the most out of our time together, and that your contributions will help others to do the same, because I'm a big believer that serving is learning. And so please, I'm looking forward to learning together with you. Thank you for the way you're showing up in the chat. Let's continue to keep that going as we kind of engage. Now, I've got a lot to talk about today, so I want to dive right into this opportunity of creating a culture of healthy opposition. 5 keys to managing conflict. Obviously, we've struck a chord. This is a topic of interest. We had nearly 7,000 people register, and we're sitting at over 2,300 of you here with us today. So this is obviously something we want to talk about. So again, thank you. And as we dive into this topic, I'd like to begin with a question if I could, but actually it's more than a question. It's actually a poll. And so I'm going to ask Monica to drop this, and I want you to kind of give me your first thoughts here. How do you usually feel when you hear the word conflict? Now, just give me your best answer here. As you think about these five choices, when you think about conflict, what's your immediate reaction? I'll give you just a few seconds to kind of give us your best response of, again, typically when you hear the word conflict, how does this typically make you feel? Do you avoid it at all costs? Do we have to talk about this? Let's fight. Just kidding. Kind of. I see opportunity and tension, and maybe there's somebody that are, hey, we were raised by wolves and we thrive on it. And so love to just get a little bit of a insight as you begin to think about this idea of conflict. So I think we've got a good number of answers here, enough to just kind of set the stage a little. So I'm going to end the poll here. I'm going to share the results so we can kind of take a look at what we came up with. Well, it looks like we have a few of you that feel like you were raised by wolves, you thrive on conflict, but man, a good majority of like, do we really have to talk about this? And then there are also some of you that do see the opportunity in the tension. Well, here's the deal, friends. Whether you're conflict averse, or whether you're conflict curious, or whether you are full-on gladiator when it comes to the arena of opposing views, my hope is that today's webinar is for you. When you think about healthy opposition, okay, as we talk about this, it's not about winning arguments or avoiding crucial conversations. It's about creating space where truth can emerge, trust can grow, and teams can thrive. That's really what we want to talk about. I want you to think about this idea of teams. I want you to imagine that your team is like a jazz band. Now, if everyone in the band is playing the same note at the same time all the time, that can get a little bit boring, couldn't it? But when there's contrast, there's different instruments, unexpected rhythms, even some tension, that's when it becomes music. And conflict, when it's truly understood and managed, well, it can be the harmony behind really high-performing teams. And so my goal today is to, number one, to define conflict and to unpack 5 essential keys to help us build a culture where healthy opposition is not only allowed, but it's encouraged. Because when it's handled correctly, conflict really isn't a threat to culture. It's the heartbeat. It's the heartbeat of innovation and clarity and growth. I love this quote from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus. I guess he's not here to correct me. He says, opposition brings concord, and out of discord comes the fairest harmony. That's really what it's all about, right? That's what it's all about. So how do we create a culture of healthy opposition? That's what I want to talk about today. Now, in order to do so, I think it's important that we understand the difference between opposition and conflict. I think it really is important for us to just spend a minute here to make sure we're clear. And so I'm kind of curious. This is where I'm going to invite some engagement, if you will, on the chat pod. My question to you is this: how do you define opposition? What do you think, friends? Give me, and as you begin to think about opposition, what is opposition? How would you define it? Okay, I like it. And again, friends, you're going to have to grab hold of it. As we got all these people join us, you're going to have to kind of grab hold of that chat pod as it's flowing and take a look at some of the answers that are coming in, because it can be a little difficult to do so. So grab a hold and start thinking. So I'm seeing things like different perspectives, different points of view. I love that. I love some of the thoughts that are coming in. Okay, great. So we're getting some really good understanding of what we view, or how we define opposition. And so now let's switch a little bit. So if that's opposition, I'm curious, how do you define conflict? So how does conflict then differ from opposition? What do you think, friends? This kind of gets you thinking a little bit about how you might define conflict versus opposition. Okay, so I'm seeing some emotion added into the definitions as we're looking at here, some tension. A lot of people adding the idea of emotion and tension kind of, and there's argumentative, there's a lack of respect. Excellent. So thank you. Again, I just want us to start thinking about, as we talk about building a healthy culture of opposition, how do we manage conflict, what the difference is. And so when you think about the difference from definition, I would suggest this. I would suggest that opposition, by definition, is an objective disagreement. Two different points of views, as many of you have already shared, right? It's an objective disagreement. I see things one way, you see things another way. That is what we might define as opposition. So conflict then, and I think many of you were alluding to this. This is my kind of a take on what you're sharing in terms of emotion and tension. I would suggest that conflict is when opposition gets personal. That when we get into conflict is when this opposition, this subjective disagreement, becomes a little bit personal. Okay, and so I would say from a conflict standpoint, conflict is when we feel threatened regarding something that we personally care about. It could be me, it could be my goals, it can be values, it can be other people, but it's usually this personal feeling, and its effects can range from this little mild irritation to even to the termination of a relationship. And so again, I want us to think about opposition, objective disagreement. But when we start talking about conflict, we're now talking about it's getting personal, right? Something that I care about, something that matters to me is feeling a little bit threatened. Now, in addition to knowing the difference between definitions, I think there's a couple other things I want to look at. For example, what is the problem that is associated with both? Both have their own individual and unique problems. Like for opposition, the problem is if we often avoid these issues because we're afraid of conflict. That's the problem we face when it comes to opposition, is we often just avoid some of the sensitive issues or topics because we are afraid that it's going to get personal. We're afraid that it's going to move into that conflict. So we tend to avoid some of the conversations and the dialogue and the topics that may be limiting the results and things that we're getting. Now, the problem with conflict is it can damage relationships. When things start getting personal, now we're talking not just we're not getting results, we're not just avoiding things. Now relationships can actually become threatened, and they can truly damage. But I'm a believer that every problem also comes with its own opportunity. And so each of these have their own very unique opportunities. So when you think about opposition, the opportunity that we have with opposition is it can be a source of productive collaboration. When we have different points of view, different perspectives, it can lead to some very productive collaboration, which can lead to better discussion and get us better decisions and even better results. So there is a great opportunity in opposition. But there's also an opportunity hidden, if you will, within conflict. Because when we move through resolution of conflict, just as the problem is that it can damage relationships, when resolved well, it actually improves relationships. When we understand how to navigate conflict and resolve it, it actually serves as a strength, a way to improve those relationships. And so that's really the opportunity. And that's one of the things I really want us to focus on today, is not just what are the problems that we face, but the opportunities that are right in front of us to be through opposition, to have source of productive collaboration, even through the conflict that arises, an opportunity to resolve and improve and strengthen relationships. I love this, and maybe some of you heard of this, that Alfred Sloan was the chairman of General Motors from 1923 to 1956. And he once said this in a meeting. He said, "Gentlemen, I take it we're all in complete agreement on the decision. So I propose we give ourselves time to develop disagreement and perhaps gain some understanding of what the decision is all about." Isn't that interesting? If we're always all in agreement, maybe one of us is not needed. Maybe because we need the opposition, we need perspective, we need to have some of this insight that opposition can bring. So how do we foster healthy opposition so that we are making the very best decisions that is going to lead to better actions that are going to get us better results? So now we have a little bit of understanding of what we're talking about, opposition versus conflict. Let's go a little bit deeper for a minute. More than just from a definition standpoint, let's think behaviorally. Let's see if we can't see the difference there. So in the chat pod, share with me, friends, what behaviors would you expect to see when we have this kind of healthy opposition? This kind of objective disagreement, this that leads to collaboration. What are you seeing, friends? Give me some insights. I'd love to see your thoughts in the chat pod, and I'm going to scroll down so I can get there. What are some of the behaviors that you might see? So we're going to see dialogue, we're going to see listening, we're going to see mutual respect. Absolutely. These are some really great perspectives. Absolutely, friends. And again, I want you to begin to envision this, because if you can see it, you can be it. And we want to be able to create that kind of a vision as we move into talking about how do we create healthy opposition? How do we navigate and manage conflict? And again, this is just me probably validating everything that has been shared in the chat pod, right? We start seeing the behaviors you're going to see through healthy opposition is people are speaking up respectfully. Dialogue, as many of you have suggested. There's going to be active listening. There's curiosity. There is focus that is directed on ideas, not people. We're not calling out individuals. We're speaking to ideas. Emotions are very regulated. There's not a lot of emotion in true healthy opposition. We're going to see shared goals stay at the center. We're really focused on those shared goals. There is an evidence of that psychological safety, people feeling safe to step up and share their ideas. And we start to see that this resolution is very collaborative. Absolutely. These are very powerful behaviors that would indicate that we've got good, healthy opposition, that collective objective, if you will. So now, okay, so what behaviors would indicate that you're moving into conflict? What do you think, friends? Give me some insights now. Now, shifting gears, now we've got the definition, things become personal. So what are some of the behaviors that you might witness when opposition moves into conflict? Okay? Isn't that interesting? We got two sides of the spectrum I'm seeing in the chat pod. We got things from we're yelling, raising our voices, to we're moving, we're just withdrawing, we're not saying anything. Got some outbursts, some angry tones, got facial distortions, right? We see some belittling, some finger pointing. We get into attack mode. Yes, these are all very strong indicators that we have moved from healthy opposition into a more personal impact of conflict. And so again, just kind of reiterating what you've already kind of shared in the chat pod. Yeah, conversations turn personal. We don't listen anymore. That listening is stopped. We see an increase in defensiveness and escalation of emotions. Dialogue completely shuts down. We are no longer in dialogue and having conversation. We start seeing some of those power dynamics. Some of you mentioned kind of were referencing that. Who's right, not what's right. There's a lot of digging in, a lot of scorekeeping, and there is no shared goals. Well, here's the deal, friends. When you think about how do we then engage opposition and prevent conflict? Opposition doesn't have to turn into conflict, that's for sure. But every conflict does have an element of some opposition in it. And so what we're going to talk about today is how do we become aware of conflict triggers in ourselves and others? Because here's the point I want this point to sink deeply as we talk about conflict resolution and how we navigate it and how we move to healthy opposition. Here's the point. You ready for it? The point is this. Conflict is a sign that something important to you is not right, and there's an opportunity to make it right. That's what conflict is. It's nothing more than a sign, right? I like to say conflict reveals values. When we move into conflict, suddenly what it tells me is something you care about or something that I care about is feeling threatened. And now we have an opportunity to figure out what that is and to solve it. And so that is the deepest point I want you to understand as we begin to think about how we move forward and navigate conflict, is to realize that all it is, when we feel that sense of moving into conflict, that's a sign. Wait a minute, something that one of us or both of us cares about is not right. And now we have an opportunity to make it right. So let's talk about how we do that. Let's talk about how we can make things right when we're feeling that things aren't right. Well, let's start with first things first. Before I get into some 5 keys of managing conflict, it's very important that you understand this first thing first, and that is you've got to bring your very best self to it. When you step up to conflict, you have got to be the very best version of yourself. And now, this is about checking yourself, right? We like to talk about starting from your best position. And when we talk about best position, we're talking about from your core, who you are, what matters most, what you truly value. Because when we work from that starting position, who our best self is, who we are in our happy place, then we can be more authentic and more agile, because being yourself with more skill is going to have greater impact than just trying to apply the skill. So before we dive in and talk about strategies, the most important thing is that as you step up to conflict, that you press the pause button, check yourself at the door and say, I'm going to bring the very best version of myself. And if I can do that, I'm going to have a greater likelihood of creating good, healthy opposition and navigating and managing the conflict that may be coming at me. So friends, just make sure you're always stepping up with your very best self. So now let me introduce you today. I'm really excited to share with you what I'm going to call 5 keys to managing conflict. Ways to help us navigate when we find ourselves, when the opposition gets a little bit personal, and now relationships are potentially threatened. There's an opportunity for damage. How do we build and strengthen those relationships as we apply these 5 keys? Now, I do have a little bit of a caveat here to let you know that today I am going to share these 5 keys through the lens of the SDI, the Strength Deployment Inventory. Now, really quickly, that doesn't mean that if you haven't had the SDI or don't know what it is, that you're not going to benefit. As a matter of fact, I got a really cool thing I'm going to share. But first, I'm just kind of curious. In the chat pod, how many of you are familiar with the SDI? Give me a yes in the chat pod if you're yes, or give me an emoji, a thumbs up. My guess is that some of you, if not many of you, are at least somewhat familiar with the SDI, the Strength Deployment Inventory. Now again, here's a cool thing. Ready for it? At the end of our webinar, as was mentioned, you are going to be getting a recording with a copy of my deck, but you're also going to receive a link for a free SDI assessment. So you will be able to take the SDI assessment. So even though I'm going to share it through a little bit of a lens, and it's just a lens, we're not going to focus so much on it, but I want you to be aware that there's going to be a little focus, but that doesn't mean if you've never had the SDI or don't know what it is, you're not going to benefit from these 5 keys. But as a matter of fact, I thought it might be helpful, if it's okay, give a little 5-minute crash course, if I will, to help maybe navigate some of the ways I'm looking at the keys I'm going to share with you. The beautiful thing about the SDI, the Strength Deployment Inventory, is it is a personality assessment. It's one of those psychometric assessments that actually gives us 4 views of ourselves, and it helps us understand other people. It is rooted in what we call relationship intelligence, how we navigate and choose to respond in our relationships that matter. Because remember, that's the potential danger and the opportunity within conflict is the relationships that are impacted in conflict. So these 4 views, so I'm just going to quickly give you a little intro, okay? The first view you get is what was called your MVS, or your motivational value system. You are going to get insight to understand what are your underlying reasons for why you do what you do. What are your beliefs and what's important to you in life? You're going to learn that there are 3 primary motives. People are motivated by people, which is blue, or performance, which is red, and green, which is process. Or we're a blend of many of those. Now again, today it's not important that you understand what your MVS is or where you land on the triangle. What's important is you understand is that each one of us has a motivational value system. There are things that matter to us, and that plays a big component, a big puzzle piece, or like a Lego block of understanding how to navigate conflict. So the SDI gives us an insight as to what matters to us. The SDI also gives us an insight into how we show up when we move into conflict. And what's interesting, what we've learned is that while our MVS, what matters to us is this blend of multiple of these 3 motives, how we show up in conflict is actually in sequence. When we're in conflict, we're feeling a threat to something we care about. And our conflict sequence is the way our motives change as we show up and face conflict. That's what you need to know. I'll explain a little bit more as I kind of tie it into these 5 keys, but we get a really powerful insight to the way that we show up and how we show up. Some of us show up in accommodating, some of us show up in asserting, some of us show up in analyzing, but no matter how we show up, we're all doing so because we feel like it's the best way for us to solve the problem at hand, to move through conflict. So those 2 views about our value system and our conflict sequence really are about our whole life and what matters to us and how we show up in conflict. The other 2 views have to do with how we show up and what we do, okay? You're going to get insight in the SDI in what's called your strengths portrait, or behaviors that you prioritize at work to be successful. Now, your top strengths are the ones you use most often. Those middle strengths are occasional. They're behaviors that I use more situationally. They're readily available. And then I have some strengths and behaviors that I don't necessarily use all the time. But how we show up and what we do is going to have a big impact on conflict and how we work together in relationships. But one of my favorite views that the SDI gives us is insight to our overdone strengths. How sometimes in an effort to get things done, to what we found working, and it's not working quite right, we tend to overdo it. And what we're going to learn is that can be a very potential trigger for conflict. If I'm overdoing a strength that you would never overdo in a million years, then guess what? There is a potential for conflict. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So again, I just wanted to give you a little crash course to help you understand the SDI is going to add some insight. And actually what it does is I share with you these 5 keys of leveraging conflict. What the SDI does is it elevates, it speeds up, it escalates the process of navigating conflict. But it doesn't mean I can't navigate it without it. So with that little bit of a lens, just so you know, I'm going to have a little bit of a lens there. Let's start looking at the 5 keys to managing conflict. And the first key is to anticipate. What might de-energize the team or individuals and maybe get in the way of being able to get the results that we want? The goal is to know our individuals and our team members well enough that we're able to spot it when it occurs, and that what we need to do to kind of get back. So a first key to navigating conflict is learning how to anticipate. And that really comes from understanding what truly can trigger conflict. Because if I can anticipate it, I can be more prepared to navigate it. I love this, and many of you probably have heard this as what's called response ability. This is from Viktor Frankl. You've probably read this book, Man's Search for Meaning. He says between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. When we think about stepping up to conflict, we have a response ability. How we're going to choose to respond is what's really going to make the difference. So if I can learn to anticipate, then guess what? I have a better opportunity to respond. And that's when we have the power of growth and freedom, okay? So anticipating conflict is helping us to be better understanding of what truly triggers conflict so I can be better prepared for it. So I'm curious, friends, as you begin to think about anticipating conflict, how do you think conflict starts? Give it to me in the chat pod. What do you think, friends? Give me some of your thoughts of how does conflict start from your point of view? Okay, so if you're thinking, as you begin to think about and anticipate, what might be a starting point or what might cause conflict to begin, okay? Okay, we see some disagreements, we see ego, I see a lot of assumptions, lack of relationship, thank you, I think those are some good insights. Maybe that we become too rigid in our beliefs, I love that thought, Pat, absolutely. Or maybe we're not meeting expectations, Levi. Yeah, a lot of conflict comes from misunderstanding, poor communication, thank you, Sarah, our different priorities. There are lots of different things that we can see that can trigger conflict. But hidden within some of these types of moments, what we behaviorally begin to see, there are really some key ingredients to where conflict starts. And it really kind of, again, ties a little bit into what we just talked about in some of these views that the SDI gives us. For a lot of us, whether it's in misalignments, whether it's been disagreements, whether it's an ego, a lot of times conflict is going to start when there is a threat. Remember, conflict is when there's a threat to something that's important to us, something that matters to us. So a lot of times conflict can start when there's a threat to our strengths or how we are choosing to show up. If I'm feeling restricted or limited in my ability to use my behaviors that I've used for years to be successful, that could trigger conflict. Or when my behaviors or the strengths that are being disregarded or insulted, or I'm feeling forced to use a behavior or a strength that really is not my preferred strength, can you see how that might pull me into a state of conflict? Because I'm feeling threatened because of I'm being asked to use these strengths. But also deep within some of the things that you shared in the chat pod, the start of conflict comes from our threat to what we value, to our motives. Now again, you can look at the colors from the SDI, but that doesn't matter as much. But imagine if you are very people-oriented and you feel a threat that people are feeling mistreated, then guess what? That's a trigger. That's going to be the start of conflict. Or if maybe you're someone who's very performance-driven and you might feel if a task is not getting done or not getting done the way it should or the speed in which you should have, can you see how that's going to pull me or start conflict? If you have a tendency, a value of being very into order and process, and that gets disrupted, wow, there's a potential conflict right there. Or if you're one that's very flexible, that can see multiple, and you don't see that, there aren't multiple perspectives, flexibility is being limited, then guess what, friends? We have a potential start to conflict. A big component of what pulls us into conflict is when our behaviors, what we do, is being threatened, or why we do it is being threatened. But there's a third one also that can start conflict, and that's when there's a threat to overdone strengths. When we see other people overdoing strengths that we would never, or I am overdoing strengths that others would never, then that is what can be a conflict starter. Whether that overdone strengths, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, is the frequency in which I do it, the duration in which I do it, the intensity in which I do it, or even the context. Sometimes it's using a strength out of context could be the start of conflict. So when you begin to think about anticipating, recognizing when there's different strengths, different motives, overdone strengths, we have some potential triggers that may lead us into conflict, because even the most well-intended strengths can be overdone to the point that they trigger conflict and they lead to unproductive outcomes in relationships. And what's important to think about here is intent is not as important as the impact, because we know the intent, we know what our intentions are, but others are feeling the impact of that. So again, the first key is learning how to anticipate where there might be conflict. And the way we do that is thinking about where there might be threats to our behaviors, what we do, to our motives, why we do it, and even some of those overdone strengths that may be unintentionally causing conflict because of the way that we're overdoing them, okay? Awesome. So now when you think about anticipating conflict, there's a couple questions. I want to help us as we prepare for each of these keys with some questions we can ask ourselves in each one of these 5 keys. So when you think about anticipating conflict, here's some questions you can ask yourself. How might I potentially trigger others? In what ways may my behaviors or my overdone strengths or my values, what matters to me, maybe I want to anticipate by just being mindful of knowing who I am and how that may trigger. I know that I have my number one strength, my top behavior is self-confidence. That has served me very well throughout my career and throughout my life. But I also know that if I overdo that, it can trigger conflict. It can move into a little bit of arrogance, and for many people that is just not good. They do not like that, and I have a potential. So I have to be very mindful and anticipate, knowing each other, knowing myself, how might I trigger other people. And then being mindful of the others, right? How might others potentially trigger me? Again, this is about just anticipating, being mindful, because awareness brings choice. When I anticipate it, I'm now prepared to better respond to it. That's really what we're talking about here. So I thought it might be interesting to try to take each of these 5 keys and kind of put them through the lens of maybe a real life situation or scenario. And so we're going to do so through the lens of Stacy and Miguel. Okay. Now, again, we're going to kind of run through each of the 5 keys. I'm going to help you see it through the lens of an experience with these 2. Now, here's the deal. For our purposes, Stacy is a senior account manager. And from an SDI perspective, they have a red-blue motivate, MVS, which means they're very motivated by performance and people. And she wants and she thrives on results and harmony. That's what she's all about. That is what she values, results and harmony, okay? So she's a senior account manager, really driven by performance, people, results, and harmony. And Miguel. Now, Miguel is a client support specialist. Now, his MBS would be blue-green. In other words, very motivated by what we might call relational integrity. Very much in process, very much about people. He very much values collaboration, clear plans, and being seen as a trusted partner. That is something that Miguel very much values. Now, this very strong pair works together to support clients. But these varying, differing motivations are about to be tested, okay? So here's what's going to happen. During a Q1 planning meeting, Stacy's going to reflect on their dynamic and says, now I know that I tend to move fast when deadlines are close. I get really focused on results. And then she says to Miguel, what helps you feel supported during crunch time? So do you see what's happening here? Stacy is anticipating the way she shows up and what matters to her might have an impact on Miguel. And so as she anticipates it, she's going to ask Miguel, I know this is how I am when it gets down to crunch time. How do you like to be supported? Now, Miguel, very much aware of what matters to him, he might say something like, Stacy, thank you for asking. I thrive when I'm in the loop, that I have space to prepare thoughtfully, and if plans change, I just need to know ahead of time, right? So I don't feel like I'm having to constantly react instead of being a contributor. So by calling out and understanding what each one of them values and what's important to them right from the start as they begin working together, they can anticipate where the potential friction and where they need to put a little energy to help build trust before that stress even shows up. So the first key to being able to leverage conflict is to anticipate, to be mindful of who I am and who they are, and make sure we call it out ahead of time. Okay, so that's key number 1, is to anticipate. Key number 2 is to prevent. Because one of the things, if we can prevent it from happening in the first place, then that is fantastic. And preventing conflict is about watching those overdone strengths of which I was referring to. So think about this. What we do has an impact on others, regardless of our intent. And this is especially true when we overdo what we do. And so a very key method to prevent conflict is to manage our overdone strengths. Being mindful of where we might overdo things, whether that be through frequency, duration, intensity, or context. For example, if you're someone who has a tendency to overdo being analytical because you like to digest, you like to dissect whatever is going on, well, if you're not careful, if you overdo that, you may come across as obsessed. You're so analytical, you become obsessed with processes, you become obsessed with the data. That's an overdone strength. Or maybe you're someone who's so helpful, you're so overly helpful that you overdo it to the point where now you become, or at least perceived as, being smothering. Or maybe you're like me and you tend to crank up your self-confidence, and that can project itself as arrogance. All of that can potentially trigger conflict in others. And so when we start thinking, how do I prevent, or at least help prevent the possibility of conflict, look at my overdone strengths. Where can I dial it down in any of these 4 areas? And then sometimes it's not about dialing down a behavior. Sometimes I can choose a different behavior. If I know that self-confidence has a tendency to get a little overdone on my side, then maybe I choose a different behavior to help me navigate the project that I'm working on or to help me get the results that I'm seeking. So when you think about managing preventing conflict, it begins with me understanding and managing my own potential overdone strengths. Where am I showing up too much? Not too long ago, I was really, really sick. I got super sick, and someone had asked me, they said, "So Scott, how you feeling?" I said, "Well, I'm probably feeling like I'm about 80%. And then it dawned on me, and that 80%, Scott, is probably just about right. 100%, Scott, might be way too much. Maybe I need to dial down the Scott sometimes." And I think that's what we can do when we start thinking about how do we prevent conflict, dial it down a little bit, where we tend to overdo it. Now, what's interesting when you think about relationship intelligence, as I mentioned, the SDI is nothing more than an assessment tool that helps us get insight to how we build relationship intelligence. Now, we call that RQ, right? You've heard of EQ, emotional intelligence. RQ is what we call relationship intelligence. Now, relationship intelligence is like the insight that allows us to adjust our approach to make each interaction more effective, okay? And there are 4 RQ skills, or relationship intelligence skills, that can help us. That is to have positive regard. As we think about preventing the potential conflict, make sure we treat people with dignity and respect, assuming their positive intentions and motives. What if we give people the benefit of the doubt? Assume positive intent. What if we become a little more service-oriented? That's going to help prevent. If we're coming from a place of curiosity and wanting to learn what people need, being willing to meet others and what they appreciate is going to help us dial down the potential and prevent conflict. Or having my own accountability, being mindful, as I just said, of my own overdone strengths, and really be having a strength-based agility. Knowing how to intentionally use my behaviors in the pursuit of those desired outcomes is going to metaphorically help us choose the right tool for the job, and in so doing, have a greater likelihood of preventing conflict from taking place. So here's some questions you can ask yourself. When you think about preventing conflict in me, making sure that questions, which overdone strengths most limit my effectiveness or trigger conflict? How might I adjust those overdone strengths? Or what productive strengths could I use instead? These are some questions to help me prevent the conflict in me. Now, when you think about conflict in other people, I might ask questions like, which overdone strengths are most likely triggering me? I want to know what happens after I'm triggered, and how can I assume positive intent or positive regard when it comes to the intention behind the overdone strengths of my peers. Just some questions to help me begin to prevent conflict from happening in the first place. Now let's go back to Stacy and Miguel. So as they begin working, they want to prevent conflict. So together what they do is they choose to create a shared working agreement. Stacy agrees that she's going to flag any scope changes or shifts in meeting times at least 24 hours in advance to help service the needs that Miguel has. And Miguel is going to say, I'm going to speak up whenever I feel like my input is being overlooked. Now, because Stacy is all about that performance in people and harmony and getting things done, it's going to give her confidence that the outcomes and relationships are going to be protected. And for Miguel, who's very blue-green, it's going to honor his need for thoughtful planning and partnership. This kind of a mutual understanding can help prevent the kinds of missteps that may lead to a lack of trust and conflict. Okay? So let's talk about the third key, which is to identify conflict. Because the earlier we can detect it, the quicker we can prevent the escalation. So how do you know that you're in conflict? Give it to me in the chat pod, Freds. I haven't had you share in the chat pod for a minute. How do you know you're in conflict? Give it to me in the chat pod. How do you know? Awesome. Yes. A lot of it has to do with our feelings, right? Absolutely. I love it. You guys are very well aware, very self-in tune. Well, there are two motives and two conditions. What happens is when things are going well and when we are in conflict. It's important that we understand these two conditions and how these motives show up, what matters to us when we're feeling good, and how our motives are impacted when we're in conflict. That's an important key ingredient to know how we show up, particularly when we start thinking about the different stages of conflict. Now, the stages of conflict really is about the narrowing of our view. In stage one, we have a full focus. We see ourselves, we see the problem, we see other people. And if we can't resolve conflict in stage one and we move to stage two, now it's what I call the forget you phase. I don't even think about them. I'm only focused on me and the problem. And if I have to get to stage three, now my focus is just about me. I move from a narrow to pure defense mode. And what I would suggest to you is how we begin to identify conflict is we begin to see the change. That's why the conflict sequence is so important. When you see someone like Kent, who's very people-oriented, very much in the people phase, move to analytic, move to analyze, that's an indicator. Or if you start seeing someone who's very analytic moving into assert, we begin to spot the cues. We begin to recognize that other people are moving to conflict. And the sooner you can see it, the sooner you can be it. I like to say, they that notice it first wins. And what do we win? Resolution. The sooner I can recognize that people are moving to conflict, the sooner I can resolve before it becomes escalated. So when we try to identify conflict, just ask a couple of questions. What changes do I notice in others' motivation? How do I see them changing and what matters to them? How will I let others know when I'm in conflict? Because sometimes it's not easy for other people to see it in me. And how can I be more intentional about spotting others in conflict? We've got to learn to look and look to learn. We've got to learn to identify it quickly. So let's go to Stacy and Miguel. So 2 weeks after this whole setup, after they got their agreement so they can prevent it, they're anticipating. Now what happens is Stacy reschedules a client meeting with short notice and doesn't tell Miguel. And during the call, she actually overrides a suggestion that Miguel makes about an implementation timeline. Now what's going to happen to Miguel? He starts to feel blindsided. He feels devalued. But true to his true to his conflict sequence, he actually doesn't immediately react. He begins to withdraw. Now, Stacy may miss this completely, but fortunately, she notices the shift. She's able to recognize his short responses, his lack of enthusiasm, his delayed replies, and her instincts nudge her to take action to fix it because she's a little bit of a red person in performance. But this time, she pauses to ask herself, is this about the task, or did I unintentionally step on one of his values? This is a key. Learning to identify when we move into conflict is very, very important. Recognizing how people show up when they move to conflict. That's why the conflict sequence is such a powerful insight from the SDI. Okay, so now we've identified it. How do we manage it? How do we navigate it? Because it's not about fixing the person, it's about shifting the conversation. And here's a really key takeaway when we talk about managing conflict. You ready for it? The key is curiosity. Friends in the chat pod, why do you think curiosity is so important? Why do you think curiosity is so important in this process of managing conflict? Yes. Look at some of these great answers. It provides openness. It shows you care. Absolutely. As we begin to manage, it isn't about fixing or changing the person. It's about shifting the dialogue to having a conversation. It's simply about managing conflict is about asking a couple of questions. What is a more generous view that I could have of why they're doing what they're doing? And how are their motives impacting the situation? It's just getting curious. It's stopping and applying some of the things we talked about from a prevention standpoint, from a managing standpoint. The more curious you can be, the more desirous to understand, the easier it will be for you to resolve conflict, the easier, at least to manage it, to move to a space of dialogue and conversation. I love it. We become very in tune to their motivation. And by the way, I did see some of the comments about Miguel, and absolutely, there are lots of different things in which Miguel could have done and Stacy could do. My goal here is to try to at least give us a little bit of a visual of how this may play out in a work type relationship. So going back to Stacy and Miguel then, as Stacy now is going to approach Miguel, she's going to calmly say something like, hey, I think I may have crossed the line. She identified that there may have been an issue here because she recognized Miguel retreating, moving into a state of conflict. She says, I changed the meeting. I jumped in on your suggestion without talking to you first. That wasn't fair to you. Can you tell me what that felt like? Do you see the curiosity? Help me understand. And Miguel then is going to be invited into dialogue. So he might say something like, I kind of felt a little out of sync. It's important for me to feel like I'm a partner, not an afterthought. And when decisions get made without me, sometimes I even question if I belong being at the table. And Stacy's going to listen. And she says, this is no longer about a single meeting, right? This is about a core motivational value that's being included and trusted. So she doesn't get defensive because she understands what's at the core. She's now managing it through curiosity, through questions, through conversation, through dialogue. And so instead what she's able to do is to acknowledge the impact and reaffirm the importance of their shared success, simply from being a little more curious. Once I identify that someone's moved into conflict, now I move into manage mode and I just get curious. Help me understand. How did you feel? How did this make you feel? And that's going to limit your own potential defensiveness and allow to have open conversation, which so many of you have highlighted as what it really means to have to overcome conflict and to build healthy opposition. Well, let's talk about the fifth key. The fifth key is to resolve it. Right? How do we come to a place where we can not just resolve the agreement, but literally restore and maintain trust? So I want you to think a little bit through the lens of where conflict happens in these various stages. So when you think about the 3 stages, and I know I just kind of gave it to you briefly, kind of a quick introduction. The focus narrows, right? We move from the full view is about self, problem, and others, and we tend to have narrowed views when we move into conflict. Sometimes I don't see them, I just see me and the problem, and then sometimes I'm just focused on me. So when I find myself in that just self mode, defend mode, discover what the values are. Ask those questions. How am I going to resolve it? What's important to you about this? Why is this so important to you? Really discover the values, the motives behind the behavior. Because often what we're arguing, what we're debating, where conflict sits is up at the top, where there's behaviors. We are disagreeing with the behaviors when we don't understand the reasons why. So discover the values. Ask the question, what's important to you about this? When we get caught up when we're focused now on just the me and the problem, ask myself, what is an acceptable solution look like? How do I define the problem? That's another key ingredient to resolution. I want to discover values so I can understand why things are important. I want to define the problem. What does it look like for you? What would it look like for me? So then once we discover values and define the problem, now we can expand the focus. So would you like to know why it's important to me? So now I understand why it's important to you, and I understand your possible solution. Now I add, as we like to say at Crucial Learning, to add meaning to the pool. That's where resolution lives. Resolution lives in dialogue. It lives in understanding. It lives in contribution. When we're each sharing our values, our solutions, and together, that's where resolution comes from. So when you think about how do we resolve, once we've identified and we've managed, and now we're trying to get to resolution, remember, discover the values, define the problem, expand the focus. When you do that, healthy dialogue is going to exist. You're going to be more curious. You're going to get better answers. And then as you begin thinking about the questions, think to yourself, these 3 questions. Why is it important to you? What do you care most about? And I love this third question. What worries you? That's a really great way of getting some really good clarity on their values or their problem solutions when you're trying to resolve conflict. Not just like, why is this important? What do you care most about? But what are your worries? What are your concerns? There's a lot of very great insight that comes from that answer to that question. So back to Stacy and Miguel. So if we take a look at Stacy and Miguel then, right, they've recognized, they've identified, and they've revisited their agreement and they update it, right? So Stacy adds Miguel to every calendar invite as a co-leader. This is going to make sure that he's not missed again, right? That's important. They know what's important. They've kind of done that. Miguel is going to agree to surface the concerns. I know some of you had mentioned that in the chat pod, that Miguel could have said something, and so he's going to say that I'm going to agree to surface those concerns even if it doesn't feel comfortable for me to do so. And then later during a team meeting, a team reflection, Stacy actually gives Miguel some credit for how well he handled this last minute change. And what happens? Miguel feels seen. Stacy feels supported. And their relationship becomes stronger. Not in spite of the conflict, but because they worked through it with understanding. Because they understood what it means to apply these 5 keys to managing conflict. They anticipated. They recognized their core differences. They acknowledged them early. They prevented. They were proactive in making sure they shared expectations that were rooted in each other's person's motivation. They were able to identify when there was a hint of conflict. That Stacy noticed the signs of Miguel withdrawing and correctly attributed them to Miguel's values and not just his behaviors. They managed it by having a value-based conversation, not a blame game, but a value-based conversation. And they moved to resolution as they came up with the right solution to update behaviors, reinforce trust, right? And I think you're right, Sandra. These are people who are willing to work. And I think what we have to do is we have to up these games. We have to up our curiosity. We have to up the skills. I like to believe that everyone is normal. Some are just more intensely normal than others, right? So I appreciate that. But here's the reality. When we understand what drives us and what drives others, conflict actually becomes less about the friction and more about clarity, right? The SDI, the strength can give us a language and an insight to those values. And when we honor those values, we actually can turn workplace tension into a powerful source of music, harmony, growth, and connection. So friends, I got an invitation for you. Because my goal is that you didn't just learn something today, that you'll become something, that you'll go put this into practice. So here's your challenge. What is one thing you're going to do in the future to better anticipate and prevent sending yourself or others into conflict? And what can you do to identify, manage, and resolve conflict in your own world? And I want you to think about, what are you going to do? Put it in the chat box right now. Call it out. What's one thing you can do to either anticipate and prevent sending yourself and others into conflict? Or how do you better identify and manage and resolve conflict moving forward? I got a lot of people saying let go of my ego. I got a lot of being curious, slowing down, taking time, paying attention, being mindful. I love this. I love this. Thank you. Thank you for being vulnerable enough to put it out there in the universe, to share it. You know, as we wrap things up, we just have a couple of minutes. Let me end with this incredible quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, who said, "Peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding." The better we understand each other, the easier it will be for us to navigate those moments of conflict and leverage them as healthy opposition to increase collaboration and communication to get better decisions, outcomes, and results. Friends, thank you for being here. Please remember, we've got up and coming webinars. On August 12th, the amazing Emily Gregory is going to talk to you about the new meaning of a manager, how to navigate today's disruptive workforce shifts. On August 26th, Carrie Lawrence is going to talk about striking a balance, lessons from the cockpit. You don't want to miss that. Make sure you register if you haven't already done so. And because you were here, let me reward you. Let me give you a code, Summer25. Write this code down. This will save 20% on any of our courses if you use this course. And of course, this is for individual purses only, not to be combined with big offers and those things. But friends, remember, healthy opposition is good. Let's not let it get personal. Let's not move to conflict, and learn how to navigate that conflict so that peace can come from true understanding. Be on the lookout for our email that's going to come afterwards. It's going to give you this recording. It's going to give you my slides, and it's going to give you a free version of the SDI. Friends, thank you. I know you're busy and you got lots on your plate. So grateful that you would take some time to be with me. You are awesome. Thank you, each and every one of you. Great. Good luck as you begin to navigate your own world of conflict and leverage in a way that brings you the outcomes and results that you desire. Thank you, everyone. So very much appreciate it.